So, I'd like to spend a little bit of time today talking about Lo Debar, Lo-Debar. It's a place mark on the map of Israel as it existed about 3,000 years ago. It's only mentioned to my knowledge at one time in the Bible, and it has no real bearing in and of itself. When I looked up the word and tried to come up with a definition of it, I actually came up with three definitions: no water, no pasture, and no voice. The only reason this place is important is because of a rather obscure man who lived and was actually hiding out there. His name was Mephibosheth. If you combine Mephibosheth with the place on the map in the wastelands of Israel called Lo Debar, even if you're a fairly serious student of the Bible, the chances are it has no meaning for you. But taken in combination in the context of the way the story played out 3,000 years ago, it has dramatic implications for us today, and I want to talk a little bit about that. But first I want to make a comment on our legal system currently in the United States. Back in the 1970s, my wife and I bought a home in the state where we lived then and still live. At the time, we filled out a purchase contract for the purchase of the property, and it was on a state-approved contract form, which most people use. That contract consisted of 2 pages, front and the back. The print was small, but it was legible. It wasn't what I would call fine print. Last year I was involved in several real estate transactions for the purchase and sale of residential real estate in the same state using state-approved forms again. The last purchase contract a year ago was 9 pages long, and that was only the basic contract. There was 2 addendums totaling another 5 pages, and there was 2 notices of disclosure totaling yet another 5 pages, for a total of 19 pages, all incorporated into the contract for the sale of one parcel of real estate. Explain to me, if you can, why we went from a 2-page purchase contract in the 1970s to 19 pages in 2014. I actually know the answer. The answer is you cannot hire enough attorneys to anticipate all the reasons a person might want to change their mind and get out of a contract. All you can do is try to anticipate loopholes and to try and close those loopholes so that once a person enters into a contract, they're bound by it. The problem is people aren't bound by contracts anymore. And this is a heart of the instruction I want to try and get at today. If you remember nothing else from this video, please remember this: the strength of any contract does not reside in how many attorneys you hire to enforce it, or in how many loopholes you will try and close by incorporating provisions into the written contract. At the end of the day, the strength of any contract resides in the character and the integrity of the persons entering into it. And that's really what I want to talk about today. Back to Lo Debar. As far as we know, because this was not a major city, it was an obscure place. It looks like it was out in the hinterlands on the east side of the Jordan River, out in the wastelands. When you combine as a composite those definitions of no water, no pasture, and no voice, you come up, at least I do, with the impression of a wasteland, somewhere out in the canyons where the wind is echoing through and not much else. Furthermore, it was undoubtedly out by the borders of the frontiers of Israel, close to their enemies, the Moabites and Edomites and the Ammonites. If a person was running and hiding, this would be the place to go, but you can only go so far before you get into enemy territory. This place became important because of a person that was hiding out there whose name was Mephibosheth. He had the bad luck of being in the line, the royal line of Israel. He was a descendant of the first king of Israel, King Saul, and would have been in the lineage of that royal line, and actually a possible successor to Saul or one of his sons to be king. The problem is he was crippled. When he was a small baby, his nurse dropped him and broke both of his feet, so he couldn't run. He had to literally be carried or walk on crutches. The fact that he got himself across the Jordan River away from the centers of power and was hiding out near the borders in Lo Debar, in a wasteland where nobody goes without a good reason, is telling. And what it's telling is he was there because he was hiding out. The reason for that is there was a civil war in Israel. His grandfather, Saul, was deposed as king. His father, Jonathan, was also killed in battle and not eligible to be king anymore. There was a civil war between Mephibosheth's uncle, who would have been king and was next in the lineage, but he was deposed by what some would call an interloper. There was a new king and a new lineage now. And if you know anything about history, you'll know that royalty and power deals harshly with threats. Mephibosheth's very existence in the lineage of the old dynasty posed a threat symbolically and materially to the new king. And so Mephibosheth was out here hiding out, and his biggest fear was that he would be found by the new king and brought in and killed, frankly, and eliminated. So he probably woke up every day and peeked outside to see if the king's men had found him. He'd run as far as he could. He had broken ankles. He was crippled. It's not like he could get on a horse and cover a lot of ground. If he'd gone much further, he'd be in enemy territory and he'd be subject to being killed by the Ammonites, Moabites, or Edomites and the enemies of Israel who congregated along the borders. So there he sat. The problem is, one day his worst fear came true. He looked out his window in the morning and saw soldiers surrounding his house, and they summoned him out and said, "The king wants to see you." This should have been a death warrant, but it was at this point that Mephibosheth caught a bit of luck, because David was no ordinary king. The new king was the hero of Israel. This was the same David who years ago had took on a 9-foot giant, killed him with a sling, and routed the Philistine army and gave Israel a great victory. He'd gone on to be a warrior hero of Israel until the existing king Saul became jealous and tried to kill him. He spent about 13 years, David did, on the run from Saul, hiding out and trying to avoid being killed himself. So what's going on? When Mephibosheth was brought before the king, David, the first words out of David's mouth was, "Don't be afraid." Instead of having Mephibosheth killed, he adopted him into his household and gave him a seat at the table. and a place in his family. Why would he do that? That's really the heart of what we want to talk about this morning. Why would David take somebody in the lineage of the king who had fallen and whom David replaced and adopt him into his household? This man posed a threat by his very existence, at least symbolically, to David's own claim to the throne. And yet that's what he did. He said, I'm taking you into my household, you have a seat at my table, I'll appoint people to manage your financial affairs, and I will treat you as family. The fact is, David had been best friends with Mephibosheth's father, Jonathan, who stood next in line to the throne to King Saul. In other words, by lineage, it would have been Jonathan, not David, who stood to become king of Israel when Saul died, which he did in battle. But Jonathan was killed too. Prior to that, however, he forfeited his claim to the throne in favor of David. The Bible tells us they were kindred spirits. They were like one person. And what's interesting about this is they were kindred spirits before they ever met, because they shared the same noble character. Just as David had taken on a 9-foot giant when the rest of Israel was cowering in the hills, Jonathan had rallied the Israel army in another battle years before. The Israeli army was outnumbered. King Saul was holding back with a few hundred men, unwilling to move forward against the Philistines. And Jonathan turned to his armor bearer one morning and said, in essence, let's go pick a fight, which he did. And between he and his armor bearer, they killed a number of Philistine soldiers. They attacked, 2 men. They attacked a Philistine garrison. And as the bloodshed mounted, the Philistines panicked, which prompted the rest of the Israeli army to pursue and win a great victory. So David and Jonathan were kindred in courage and in their devotion to God. If you read the stories in the Old Testament, in the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel, you'll see that they both relied on their faith and confidence in the God of Israel. And so Jonathan, even though David was on the run, threatened with death by his own father Saul, Jonathan went to David and stood with him and said, you're going to be king of Israel. I'm not. I'll stand next to you and support you. And they had such affection for each other that it drove them to form a covenant to take care of each other and to take care of each other's descendants if anything happened to either one of them. Covenants are the oldest, most sacred, and most binding forms of contracts ever devised. They go back to ancient times, before there were armies or law enforcement officers, before there were governments of any kind, and before there was a legal structure to enforce contracts. And they worked as follows. There were several elements to them, but ultimately they were grounded in the integrity and the character of the people entering into them. A covenant always involved the following elements. There had to be a shedding of blood. That bloodshed symbolized what would be done and what you were agreeing to if you failed to perform and live up to the terms of the covenant. Sometimes they would cut themselves and drink each other's blood in the most ancient forms. Sometimes, most often, they would sacrifice an animal and say, this is what's to be done to me if I fail to live up to my agreement. and then they would engage in what's known as a fellowship meal. Always there was an oath, a vow to perform, to not break the terms of the covenant, regardless of feelings or circumstances. That's the reason you have covenants and contracts, because feelings and circumstances always change, but the person or persons you're engaged in the contract with, frankly, are relying on your performance, regardless of your circumstances. So a covenant always involved bloodshed. It always involved an oath, and it always invoked a third party guarantee. That party always being somebody stronger than either of the principles in the covenant. In other words, what you're saying is, we're killing this animal. May this be done to me if I fail to live up to my agreement. And to ensure that this be done to me, I grant authority to this higher, more powerful person or entity to enforce the terms of the agreement. Often they would swear by God, they might swear by the king. If you swear by your dead mother, that doesn't do much, okay? So this was always a testimony and an oath taken in the name of a more powerful third party, and often God. David and Jonathan had entered into this kind of a covenant, agreeing to take care of each other and each other's descendants should something happen to one of them, which it did to Jonathan. He was killed and fell in battle. Subsequent to this covenant, David was on the run. He ended up hiding out from King Saul by going to the enemy territory and working as a mercenary for the Philistines. Ultimately, the Philistines went to war with Saul and killed him. David then came back to Israel and was anointed king of the southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin. The northern tribes engaged in a civil war with David under the leadership of another of Saul's sons, who was ultimately killed, at which point David was crowned king over a unified Israel. He then took the city of Jebus and established his capital there. Jebus is one of the most ancient cities on earth, and it's still inhabited today. It was a stronghold, fortress city right in the middle of Israel. It had existed there for hundreds of years, surrounded by Israelis who were not their friends. And yet it was such a stronghold that Israel could not take it until David came into the picture. He was able to conquer the city of Jebus, which goes back to ancient times and actually was named even prior to that as Salem. Today it's known as Jerusalem. It's still a stronghold city, which three major religions claim as its source and its identity. So David captured the city and settled it. And there's three hills there that are of primary importance: Mount Zion, Mount Moriah, and the Mount of Olives, which became important in the New Testament times and is going to be important again at the end times when Christ returns. David established his throne on Mount Zion, which he called the City of David. He planned to build a temple, which his son actually did complete, across the valley on Mount Moriah. It was on Mount Moriah where Isaac and Abraham had come hundreds of years earlier, and Abraham had planned, in obedience to God's instruction, to kill and sacrifice his son Isaac. So these hilltops had significance throughout history. Now David claimed it for his capital and his capital city and renamed it Jerusalem. David is now at peace with his enemies. His kingship is established. He's enthroned on Mount Zion, and it comes to him that he made a vow. And so he asked the people around him, is there any of Jonathan's descendants that we need to seek out and find and show kindness to? And that's where Mephibosheth entered the picture. So what's the point? What difference does it make that David went and found a descendant of Saul and son of Jonathan, brought him in and adopted him? What does that have to do with us? And of equal importance, why did David bother? There was nobody to enforce that covenant. He was supreme in the land. He was a king, an absolute monarch. He had the power of life and death over people. He was established over a unified Israel and fortified in one of the strongest city fortresses in the known world at that time, on Mount Zion. What would compel him to bother to go out and look for a crippled descendant of Jonathan? The answer is David was compelled because he made a covenant with Jonathan, and he was compelled by the strength of his own character, whether Jonathan was dead or alive, to fulfill the terms of his vow and the terms of that covenant. Another way of saying it would be that David could not have failed to live out that agreement and still been David. He would have broken faith, not with Jonathan, but he would have broken faith with his own character. And that's the whole point of the story. So what does that have to do with us? Well, the fact is, we're all Mephibosheth. If you look at that story, it actually happened. It's a true story recorded in the Bible, but it's recorded for our benefit because Mephibosheth represents all of us. And David represents God himself. We're no different than Mephibosheth. We're crippled by sin. We're living in the flesh in a wasteland, threatened by enemies if we move, in fear of the king's wrath, a fear that we're going to die and have to face his judgment, and we're without any real hope of rescue. So, as aliens separated from God and crippled by sin, we live in fear. And we live in denial. And we try and find some way to rescue ourselves. Only to find out that the king we fear hasn't been seeking us out to punish us or kill us, but he's been seeking us out to bring us into his household, offer us mercy, and give us a seat at the table. Literally adopted into the family of God. That's what that story's about. That's what Christ did. Jesus said the night before he was betrayed and crucified on our behalf, he broke bread and wine and he said, "This is my body and this is my blood in a new covenant." We are not principals in that new covenant. We're beneficiaries of it. The covenant was cut, and that was actually a term for entering into a covenant. That's where the term cutting a deal comes from. It was a cutting, a bloodletting. And Jesus and God the Father cut the deal. In eternity past, long before we were ever here, I believe Jesus stood before God the Father, pointed to you, pointed to me, and said, "Father, my blood for theirs." God elected and appointed Jesus as a mediator who stands between us and God's wrath. And it's his blood that was shed to bring us into the household of God by covenant. The good news is we don't have to feel saved. We don't have to feel worthy. We just have to accept what's been done on our behalf and accept the seat at the table. I mentioned in connection with Jerusalem, Mount Zion and Mount Moriah, that it had once been called Jebus, the city of the Jebusites, and before that, in very ancient times, it was known as Salem. During that era, which dates back to Abraham, the forefather of all the Jewish nation and God's people, in those ancient times, there was a priest king reigning in Salem. His name was Melchizedek. He's an obscure person, and people have wrestled, Bible scholars have wrestled with his identity for hundreds of years. But he was a type, and he was identified for us as a type of Christ. God himself identified Jesus with this ancient priest king when in Psalms, and reiterated again in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, God the Father says to Jesus, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." The reason why that's a type is because Melchizedek was identified as a priest without lineage, without a beginning or an end. He's also, to my knowledge, the only person in the Bible who holds two offices of priest and king. Those were always separate offices. Yet this Melchizedek was both, as is Christ. The other thing of note is when God appointed Christ as a type of Melchizedek, the writer of the book of Hebrews tells us that this was a covenant because God, having no one greater as a third-party guarantee to swear by, it says he swore by himself, by his own nature and character. If that hasn't dawned on you yet, let me explain it to you. It means that our salvation is not conditioned on us. We're the beneficiaries of a covenant between God the Father and God the Son. The third-party guarantee for that covenant is the character and integrity of God himself, because there was no one greater for him to swear by. So if we doubt that we've been adopted into God's family, we can start worrying about that when God changes his character or his integrity or breaks his word. David was driven by the strength of his own character to perform and go find Mephibosheth and bring him in, even though he was an enemy of David's line. We're enemies of God. And yet God, because of his covenant and Christ's shed blood, God the Father is driven by his own character and nature to seek us out and to bring us in